The most beautiful thing about learning is that no one can take it away from you. Hello my dear students, welcome to the channel. This is Annapurna and today I'll be explaining about flower pollination, the types of pollination and the agents of the pollination. So keep watching. Now children, what is pollination? The pollination is the first step to reproduction of the plants. Now, do the plants reproduce like animals? Yes, even the plants reproduce. They produce more of their own kind, and the first step is pollination, leading to fertilization and the formation of fruit and seeds. So now, to understand pollination, let's first learn about the flower and its parts. Now, flower is the reproductive part of the plant where the reproduction takes place. Now, the flower is similar to a beautiful palace. As the palace has different parts in it, even the flower has many parts in it. So, now let's study the parts of flower. Now, in the flower, the lowermost green colored part is known as the sepals or the calyx, which is similar to the security guard of the palace who protects the palace. Now this calyx, it protects the flower as it is the reproductive part of the plant. Now the next part is the petals or the corolla. Now this part is similar to the different attractive places within the palace which attracts many people and the tourists to come to visit the palace. Now this corolla or the petals, it attracts many insects like butterflies, honeybees and the other birds also like hummingbirds and the nectar feeding bats who come to visit the flower. Now the next part is the male reproductive part of the flower, that is the stamens, which is similar to the king of the palace who has a separate room for himself. Now the most important part is the female reproductive part of the flower, which is similar to the queen of the palace who has a separate room for herself. Now, in this flower, the reproduction starts and takes place. So now, the first step is pollination, which leads to the fertilization in the flower. So, what is this pollination? Now, pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from the male part of the flower, that is the stamen, to the stigma of the flower, that is the carpel, to the female part of the flower. So this transfer of the pollen grains from the male part to the female reproductive part of the flower is said to be pollination. Now, pollination are of two types, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, the head of the male part of the flower, that is stamen, is known as the anther, which produces pollen grains. The anther produces and stores the pollen grains. This, after maturation, it bursts open and releases the pollen grains, which is accepted by the stigma. Now, what is self-pollination? The transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of the stamens to the stigma of the carpel of the same flower or of different flower of the same plant is said to be self-pollination. And what is cross-pollination? the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of the stamen to the stigma of the carpel of different flowers of different plants is said to be cross-pollination. Now, this self-pollination takes place in the flower which has both the male and the female part of the flower, whereas in the cross-pollination it takes place where the flower has either any one part, either the male part, that is stamen, or the female part, that is the carpels. So now let's understand what are the agents of the pollination who bring about this pollination within the flowers. Now, as we know, the plants cannot move like animals. So how do the pollen grains get transferred from one flower to the other flower? So an agent does this work. Agent is the transporter of the pollen grains from one flower to the other flower. So the agents of pollination are wind, water, insects and animals. Now what happens in the wind pollination? In the wind pollination, the pollen grains are light enough so that they can travel along the movement of the wind and they reach the flowers. The pollen grains likewise are transferred from one flower to the other flower. So these flowers are also known as anemophilous flowers. Now next is the water pollination. In the water pollinated flowers, the pollen grains are released on the surface of the water in the aquatic plants that grow in the water, like the Vallisneria or the lotus. So the pollen grains are released on the surface of water and they move along with the water and they reach the flowers, and thus pollination takes place. Now in the insect pollination, the insects like the butterflies or the honeybees or any flies, they are attracted towards the bright color of the petals of the flowers. So when they come to visit the flowers or to have the nectar from it, they sit on the flower, and in the due course of time the pollen grains get stuck to their bodies, and when they move to the next flower, these pollen grains are being transferred from one flower to the other. So this is how the insect pollination takes place. And in the animal pollination, the animals and the birds like the hummingbirds or the nectar feeding bats, when they come to visit the flowers to have the nectar, they carry the pollen grains from one flower to the other. So this is how the pollination takes place in the animal pollination. So this was all about pollination. I hope children you have understood the flower, the parts of the flower, and what is pollination, and the types of pollination, and the agents who bring about the pollination. So, and also I have given the notes below in the description box. And if you have any questions or doubts, you can send me any question. You can write below in the comment section. I'll reply you. So, take care, bye-bye, and remember, pollination is the first step to reproduction of the plants. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more such videos.